On my granddaughter's 8th birthday, she unwrapped a porcelain doll that looked old and carefully kept, the kind you'd expect to see behind glass. At first she smiled, then her face tightened. She held it out to me and asked why the eyes seemed to catch the light in a strange way. I bent closer and felt my stomach drop. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I put the doll aside, took note of what I saw, and started gathering what I needed. I called a lawyer that same evening. 3 days later, officers showed up at their house. Weeks after that, my daughter-in-law was led out in handcuffs, but everything traces back to that doll. That afternoon is still clear in my mind. It was a Saturday, warm and bright, the kind of weather Dorothy would have loved. We were in my backyard in Myers Park, hydrangeas spilling along the fence she'd planted years earlier. Sophie was turning 8, surrounded by kids who still trusted the world. I'd rented a bounce house, brought in a face painter, and baked her favorite strawberry cake using Dorothy's old recipe. The kitchen smelled like sugar and vanilla, and for a while it felt like nothing could touch us. Neighbors drifted in with their children. Jennifer and Chris Adams arrived with their son, Lucas, and a couple of other kids followed close behind. Soon they were racing across the lawn, laughing at a pitch only 8-year-olds manage. Marcus hovered near the patio, eyes fixed on his phone, distant in that familiar way. My son was 42 and still avoided my gaze. Vanessa moved through it all, refilling cups, straightening paper hats, smiling wide. She played the role flawlessly. I'd learned over time that perfection can be a warning. Around 3, the doorbell rang. A delivery driver stood there holding a white box tied with a silver ribbon. The card was written in careful cursive and addressed to Sophie, signed with love from Grandma Carol and me. Vanessa stepped up beside me just then. She said her parents couldn't make it, but they'd sent something instead. As she spoke, she flicked a sharp look toward Marcus. He didn't lift his head. Sophie didn't notice any of it. She ripped the paper open, smiling wide. Inside was a porcelain doll dressed in an old-fashioned Victorian gown, glass eyes that reflected the afternoon sun. Sophie cradled it like something fragile and precious, turning it gently in her hands. She said it was beautiful. Then she paused, her forehead creasing. She asked why the doll's eyes sparkled in a strange way. I leaned in. For a second I told myself it was just how the light hit the glass. Then I saw it. Set deep in the right eye, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was a tiny dark circle, a lens. My chest tightened. The noise of the party seemed to fall away, replaced by the dull rush of blood in my ears. This wasn't a toy. It was a device. I didn't react. Years in a classroom had taught me how to keep my face still. I told Sophie I needed to check the doll for loose pieces and suggested she go play with Lucas. She ran off without a second thought. I held the doll carefully, the way you handle something that matters later. Vanessa watched me, her smile fixed in place. She asked if everything was all right. I said it was fine, just being cautious with an old toy. She agreed easily. Her tone was sweet. Her eyes were not. I carried the doll through the kitchen, past framed photos of Dorothy, and into my study. I closed and locked the door. I didn't raise an alarm. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't call the police. I did what I've always done when something didn't make sense. I started paying attention. By the time the party ended, the lawn was quiet again. Parents rounded up tired children, making polite conversation as they left. Vanessa and Marcus said their goodbyes, all smiles and vague plans. Sophie hugged me goodnight, still buzzing from sugar and gifts. I tucked her into the guest room where she stayed every weekend. She fell asleep content, clutching one of her new toys, not the doll. Once the house was still, I returned to my study. I set the doll on my desk under the lamp. Shadows stretched across the room as I took out my magnifying glass, the same one I'd used for decades while grading papers. Up close, there was no doubt. The right eye housed a miniature camera, wireless, high quality. I could see the aperture and the fine circuitry tucked behind the glass. I turned the doll over and used a letter opener to loosen the base. Inside the padding was a small GPS tracker about the size of a coin, battery-powered, active. I photographed everything. Proof doesn't mean much if you can't show it clearly. And this wasn't me imagining things. For weeks, I'd had that uneasy sense of being watched in my own house, the kind you try to dismiss. I blamed it on getting older, on living alone, on the quiet that settled in after Dorothy passed. I told myself grief plays tricks. Sitting there with that doll, I knew I'd been wrong. A memory surfaced from a few weeks earlier, the moment that should have stopped me cold. I'd come home early from the hardware store and heard voices upstairs. Vanessa was in Sophie's room. I moved slowly up the stairs, careful with the old boards that know when to creak and when not to. I heard Vanessa say, calm and cheerful, that when people asked about Grandpa Sweetheart, Sophie could just say I forgot things sometimes. She laughed softly, like it was nothing. I paused in the hallway just out of view. Sophie sounded uncertain. Vanessa reassured her, telling her I was getting older, that I might need special help soon and that there was nothing to worry about. I should have stepped in then. I should have asked her exactly what she thought she was doing. But I've spent my life researching problems before reacting to them. When something doesn't add up, you gather facts first. So I took out my phone and recorded. After that day, there was more. Vanessa on calls she thought I couldn't hear while I rested, talking about paperwork being nearly ready, about placing me somewhere and starting the process. Another time, she said I wouldn't resist much longer, that I was too old to understand what was happening. Each time I told myself I was being overly suspicious, that I was hearing things through fear. The doll erased that doubt. I leaned back in my chair as it settled in. This wasn't concern. It was calculation. My house, the one Dorothy and I bought decades ago, my savings from a lifetime of teaching, what little I'd managed to invest. On paper, it all added up to a number big enough to make someone impatient, big enough to make me an obstacle. I could hear Dorothy's voice in my head, clear as ever, telling me to trust my instincts. She always said they were sharper than most people's logic. I looked down at the doll again. Its painted smile didn't seem harmless anymore. Everything lined up, the careful coaching, the monitoring, the quiet preparations. They likely already had a place picked out for me, somewhere cheap and far away. I didn't have much time. I couldn't turn to Marcus. He'd made his choice earlier that day, standing on the patio and saying nothing. Friends wouldn't help either. Even the ones who believed me wouldn't know what to do with this. I needed someone who dealt with situations like this before. Someone who understood that abuse doesn't always leave marks you can see. Sometimes it's presented as care. Concern dressed up as love. That's what made it harder to see. I needed someone who understood what it looks like when family turns into a threat. Around 2 in the morning, I sat at my desk searching for attorneys who handled elder law and family exploitation in Charlotte. One name kept coming up: Elizabeth Warner. I called the emergency number just after sunrise. By mid-morning, while most people were heading to church or still asleep, I was downtown in her office. She agreed to meet on a Sunday, which told me more than her resume ever could. The doll sat between us on her desk, its glass eyes catching the light. Elizabeth studied it carefully without picking it up, leaning in with her reading glasses low on her nose. She asked how long I'd suspected something was wrong. I told her 3 weeks, at least consciously, longer if I was being honest. She played the recordings quietly from her computer. Vanessa's voice filled the room, calm and rehearsed, explaining how Sophie should describe me to others. Elizabeth didn't react. When the audio stopped, she looked straight at me and asked if anyone had suggested I needed help. Memory care, assisted living. I told her about the comments, the questions about whether I remembered things, whether I was taking medication. How Sophie had started asking if I was okay, if I needed help doing simple tasks. It hadn't been random, it had been taught. Elizabeth slid her keyboard closer and told me this was exactly what she handled. Financial exploitation through guardianship abuse. She said what I described followed a familiar pattern. As she typed, she explained she'd already checked court filings that morning. A petition for guardianship had been submitted 10 days earlier. I felt my stomach drop. That was before the party, before the doll ever arrived. She turned her screen toward me. My name sat at the top of the documents. Admission paperwork for a nursing facility had already been prepared and filed with the county probate court. Everything looked polished and official. My signature appeared in several places. I hadn't signed any of it. Elizabeth clicked to another page and told me the attorney of record was Richard Thornton. The name meant nothing to me. She pulled up additional filings. He'd submitted several similar cases that year, all involving elderly individuals with sizable assets and sudden claims of incapacity. In every case, estates had been liquidated within 2 months of placement. She showed me a photo from a professional publication. A man in his 40s, tailored suit, practiced smile, eyes that didn't miss much. Something fell into place. I told Elizabeth I'd seen him before. She looked up at that. I explained about Vanessa's phone, how it sometimes lit up with messages when it was charging on the kitchen counter. The sender was listed as RT. I'd assumed it was work. She was in pharmaceutical sales after all. But there had been pictures too, dinners at restaurants. I'd written them off as client meetings. When I actually thought back, I realized something I hadn't wanted to notice. It was always just the two of them, wine on the table, low light, no colleagues. I said it out loud and my voice sounded distant even to me. Those weren't business meetings. Elizabeth leaned back slightly and told me, without hesitation, that she believed my daughter-in-law was involved with the attorney and working with him to have me declared incompetent. She said this went beyond simple exploitation. It was coordinated fraud, possibly more serious than that. The room seemed to close in as she explained what would follow if they succeeded. Once a court declared me unfit and placed me in a facility, control of everything would shift to them. The house, the savings, the investments, roughly $400,000 all told. With legal authority, they could sell it off quickly, while I'd be confined somewhere with no standing to object. She paused before adding that people in those circumstances often don't last long, especially when the people in charge benefit from cutting costs. She didn't need to say the word. I understood. She must have seen it on my face because she told me we were going to challenge it. First, I was to file a police report about the surveillance equipment. Everything else would be documented as well. The recordings, the pattern of coaching, all of it. There was an emergency hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. Fast by legal standards, but not fast enough to prevent them from pushing harder. I asked what that might look like. She said they'd try to provoke incidents. Anything to make me appear confused, unstable, or unsafe. Something that involved police or a hospital would serve their purpose. They needed proof for the judge. She told me to be cautious, to stay in public as much as possible, and not to be alone with Vanessa or anyone tied to her. I agreed, though my thoughts were already ahead of her. She was right about one thing. The pressure wouldn't wait. It started the very next day. Monday afternoon, after I'd spent the morning at the police station filing my report and watching an officer log the doll into evidence, Vanessa called with a suggestion that made my blood run cold. The officer handled my recordings with practiced detachment. A case number was assigned, and I was told someone from fraud would be in touch. By the time I got home, I tried to focus on something ordinary. I was halfway through making lunch when my phone rang. Vanessa greeted me cheerfully. She said Sophie had been asking about doing something special, just the two of them, a little birthday outing during the week. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. She explained she was off that day, would pick Sophie up at 2, do something fun, and have her back by 5. She said she'd text me the address. 3 hours notice. Every instinct I had told me not to agree, but refusing would make me sound suspicious, uncooperative, exactly what they needed. She mentioned Sophie was still asleep, said everything was set, and ended the call. I stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, Elizabeth's warning repeating in my head. They'll try to create an incident. At 1:30, Marcus's truck pulled into the driveway. He walked up slowly like someone bracing for bad news. He said he was just stopping by to check on me. We stood in the doorway, neither of us quite knowing what to say. Then he told me to be careful that day. I asked him what he meant. He looked away, opened his mouth, then shut it again. He said he had to go. I watched him leave, understanding more from what he didn't say than from what he did. He knew something, not enough to stop it, but enough to be afraid. Vanessa arrived right on time. Sophie hugged me, told me she'd see me at 5. I promised her she would. I stood there as the car pulled away, Sophie waving from the back seat until they turned the corner. Once they were gone, I took out the watch I'd bought the day before. It was small and pink, marketed as a child safety device. I'd tested the alert button already. I sent a message to Sophie's phone, telling her grandpa had a new watch for her and asking her to have her mom help put it on. I told her to press the red button if she needed me for any reason at all. A couple of minutes later, she sent back a picture, smiling, the watch on her wrist. Vanessa probably saw it as harmless. Just another indulgence from a doting grandfather. The next hour dragged. I couldn't settle on anything. At 3:15, my phone buzzed with an address and a short message saying they'd see me at 5. I looked it up immediately. The satellite image showed a stretch of low industrial buildings on the edge of the city. The listing said the unit was vacant, available for lease. No place a child would go for a celebration, just empty buildings in an area that stayed quiet during the day. My hands went cold. I could hear Elizabeth's voice again, warning me about police and hospitals. I grabbed my keys. I wasn't waiting until 5. I arrived at 4:30, half an hour early. The parking lot was deserted. The industrial complex felt abandoned, the kind of place that empties out long before evening. Building 4929 sat there with dark windows and weeds breaking through the pavement. A weathered sign advertising it for lease hung loose in the wind. There were no cars, no balloons, nothing that suggested a child had been there at all. I walked around the building, checking each entrance. Every door was locked. The windows were dusty and unlit. It was clear no one had been inside for a long time. My chest tightened. I tried calling Vanessa. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. The same result. I sent a text asking where they were. Nothing. I called Sophie's phone. No answer. Fear started to rise sharp and fast, but I forced myself to slow down. Panic clouds judgment. Then my phone vibrated. Not a call, an alert. The emergency signal from the watch. Location was nowhere near the industrial park. It pointed to a residential address across the city. Carol Martinez's house, a 25-minute drive. My hands shook as I called emergency services. I told them my 8-year-old granddaughter had triggered an SOS, that I'd been deliberately sent to the wrong place, and that I believed she was in danger. They asked if I was her legal guardian. I said yes and mentioned the open guardianship case and my attorney. The dispatcher's voice changed immediately. Officers were sent. I was told to wait for them before entering the home. I didn't wait. I drove faster than I had in years, gripping the wheel as if that would get me there sooner. Every stoplight felt endless. When I turned onto the street, a patrol car pulled up almost at the same time. The officer introduced himself and confirmed the alert came from that address. I told him Sophie was inside and that I'd been misdirected on purpose. We approached the house together. It looked tidy and ordinary with trimmed grass, flower beds, and a flag by the door. The kind of place that looks harmless from the outside. I rang the bell. Carol Martinez answered with a practiced smile, acting surprised to see me with an officer. She started to say there been a simple misunderstanding, that Sophie had been playing. Sophie appeared behind her in the hallway. The moment she saw me, her face fell apart. She pushed past Carol and ran straight into my arms, crying that I'd come for her. "You came," she said through tears. "Grandma told me you forgot about me. She said you weren't coming." I held her close, tighter than I ever had. I told her I would never forget her, not ever. Vanessa stepped out from the back of the house, her smile stiff, barely holding. She told the officer there had been a mix-up, that they were celebrating and I must have gotten confused about the address. Officer Cooper didn't react. He said he'd seen the message she sent me and that it didn't match where we were. Robert Martinez spoke up then, defensive, saying their daughter had every right to take her child wherever she wanted. The officer didn't engage with him. He said he needed to speak with Sophie alone. He crouched down to her level and led her a few steps away, his voice low and calm. I watched her nod, rub her eyes, answer quietly. When he returned, his expression had changed. He said Sophie told him she'd been brought there without warning, that adults had been asking her questions about me, about whether I forgot things, whether I took care of her properly. She said she was scared. That was when she pressed the button. Carol's smile finally slipped. She said they'd only been talking. Officer Cooper asked for statements from everyone and took out his notebook. He told me I'd need to come down to the station the next day to file a formal report. There were no arrests, not yet, but everything was being documented. I took Sophie home. She fell asleep in the car before we even pulled onto my street, worn out from crying. I carried her inside and put her to bed. She didn't stir. Afterward, I went into my study and connected the watch to my computer. It had logged her location every 30 seconds. The map showed the entire route from my house straight to the Martinez home. There was no stop anywhere near the industrial park. Then I noticed another folder, audio backup. I opened it and put on my headphones. The recordings were time-stamped and stored automatically. I selected the one from 3:47 p.m. At first, there was only background noise, movement, fabric shifting. Then Vanessa's voice came through clearly. "All right, Sophie, let's practice again. This is important." Sophie's voice followed, quiet and tired. She said she didn't want to practice anymore. Then Carol Martinez spoke, calm and firm. She told her they'd already talked about this, that Grandpa needed help. Real help. And you're the only one who can make people listen. My chest tightened as the voices continued. Vanessa explained that when the social worker asked, and she said she would, Sophie needed to say that I forgot things. Not vaguely, specifically. That I forgot to make her meals, that she had to remind me. Sophie started crying, saying it wasn't true, that I always made her breakfast. Carol stepped in, her tone calm but firm. She told Sophie to listen carefully, asked if she loved her grandpa. When Sophie said yes, Carol told her this was how she could help me, that if she didn't tell people I needed care, something bad might happen. What if I fell and no one was there? What if I forgot my medicine and got very sick? Sophie was sobbing now, saying she didn't want me to get sick. Vanessa told her then she had to help them help me. She told her to say the words. Sophie hesitated, then repeated them so quietly they barely registered, that her grandpa couldn't take care of himself anymore. I stopped the recording for a moment, my hands unsteady. This went far beyond watching me. They were breaking a child down, piece by piece. I forced myself to press play again. Vanessa praised her, calling her a good girl. Then Carol added that when asked where I should live, Sophie needed to say somewhere with nurses watching me all the time. Sophie protested, saying she wanted me at home with her. Vanessa's voice hardened instantly. She told Sophie she was being difficult, asked her if she wanted something bad to happen to me. Sophie panicked and said she'd say whatever they wanted. Robert's voice drifted in from somewhere else in the room, asking about the watch. Vanessa brushed it off, saying it was just a child's tracker, that I was too old to figure out it recorded sound anyway. That was when the anger settled in, cold and steady. There was a doorbell in the background. Vanessa told Sophie to remember the story, that Grandpa had gotten confused about the address. That was all. I stopped the playback and sat there in the dark, Sophie's frightened voice still ringing in my ears. The door to my study opened. Marcus stood there, pale, eyes rimmed red. He said he needed to talk, that he couldn't sleep. Then he saw my face and asked what had happened. I handed him the headphones and restarted the recording without saying a word. I watched him as he listened, saw the color drain from his face, saw the realization hit. He ripped the headphones off and stared at me. "Oh my God, Dad." "I knew she wanted you placed somewhere," he said quietly. "I knew about the attorney, but I didn't know she'd do this. Not to Sophie, not like this." I asked him if he'd known all along. He dropped into the chair across from me, shoulders slumping. He told me he'd found messages between Vanessa and Thornton 6 months earlier. An affair. Conversations about my estate. About how profitable a guardianship could be. When he confronted her, she threatened him. She said if he left or told anyone, she'd take Sophie and make sure he never saw her again. His voice broke as he said he thought staying silent would keep Sophie safe. I told him he was wrong. He nodded, eyes rimmed red. Then he said he had everything, texts, emails, receipts from hotels. He'd kept them as leverage, something to protect himself if he needed it. He admitted he'd been too afraid to use them. But after what he just heard, after listening to his daughter being pushed and frightened, something shifted. He stood up straighter than I'd seen him in years. He said he would testify, against Vanessa, against Thornton, against anyone involved. Sophie deserved better, he said. And so did I. We didn't have much time. 9 days until the emergency hearing. 9 days for them to realize we weren't blind anymore. 9 days for them to regroup or try something reckless. I called Elizabeth Warner that night. There was too much to organize in too little time. By Wednesday morning, her conference room looked nothing like an office. It felt more like a command center. 2 days had passed since the SOS alert. 2 days since I'd heard my granddaughter being coerced. 2 days since Marcus finally chose where he stood. 7 days remained. The table was covered with documents, photographs, transcripts. Elizabeth stood at the front, focused and precise. Marcus sat beside me, untouched coffee in front of him. He'd moved into my guest room. Elizabeth started listing what we had. The doll was first, already in police custody. Forensics had traced its transmission to an address registered to Thornton's law office. Marcus reacted to that. The GPS tracker matched the same source. Then came my recordings from weeks earlier. Vanessa coaching Sophie before any of this surfaced. Next, the audio from Sophie's watch. The full session. The threats. The pressure. Elizabeth turned to Marcus. He opened a folder, hands unsteady, and slid it onto the table. Messages between Vanessa and Thornton spanning 6 months. Discussions about timing. About placing the old man. About how quickly assets could be liquidated once it was done. Marcus spread the papers across the table. On the page, my life was reduced to numbers. Hotel receipts charged to a card Vanessa and Marcus shared. 15 stays over 6 months. Another document showed the guardianship petition filed 10 days before Sophie's birthday. Nursing home admission forms followed, already filled out, my signature forged, Vanessa listed as the one acting on my behalf. David Sullivan arrived shortly after. He'd been my colleague at the university for decades. He looked at Elizabeth and said plainly that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. He called the claim of incompetence ridiculous. Elizabeth noted everything. David agreed to testify. He talked about our standing chess games every Tuesday at the Independent Living Center, how we'd played for 3 years straight. He smiled slightly and said I beat him most weeks, but not always. He added that a man with dementia doesn't play chess the way I do. Elizabeth opened her laptop and brought up her own findings. She dug into Thornton's history. 3 nearly identical cases in the last year and a half. Older clients with assets, sudden claims of incapacity, guardianship transferred to relatives. In each case, the estates were liquidated within 90 days. Marcus asked how someone like that kept his license. Elizabeth said the clients either passed away quickly or were isolated enough that no one challenged it. Families benefited and stayed silent. Then she pulled up another file. Carol and Robert Martinez, records from years earlier. Robert's mother had been placed in a nursing home in 2015, shortly after they obtained guardianship. Her estate had been just under $200,000. Within a year, it was gone. Adult Protective Services had looked into it, but the statute of limitations had already run out. Marcus's face drained of color. Elizabeth said Vanessa hadn't invented any of this. She learned it. Institutionalize, isolate, then liquidate. A method that had already worked once. The room went still. She laid out the plan. We, present the surveillance devices as proof of premeditation, the recordings showing coaching and manipulation, the audio from Sophie's watch. Marcus would testify about the affair and the coordination with Thornton. David would speak to my competency. A financial expert would confirm I managed my assets responsibly and independently. Elizabeth warned us what the other side would argue, that my recordings were taken out of context, that this was a family acting out of concern. Our job was to show it was about money and that they'd used a child to get it. Marcus asked quietly if he would lose Sophie. Elizabeth told him that cooperating and protecting his daughter mattered. The court would take that into account. She said joint custody was likely, with me as the primary caretaker until Vanessa was evaluated. Best case for Vanessa would be supervised visits. Worst case would involve criminal charges for conspiracy, elder abuse, and child endangerment. She looked around the table and said we had a strong case, but she also reminded us that people backed into corners make dangerous choices. For the next 7 days, she told us to stay visible, stay around others, and document everything. With witnesses, they wouldn't be able to invent incidents. I wanted to believe the danger had passed, but I'd already learned what happens when you assume people will stop once they're exposed. I wasn't willing to make that mistake again. Friday morning, I walked into the Mecklenburg County Courthouse with my son at my side and Elizabeth a few steps ahead of us. The hearing that would decide whether I kept my autonomy stretched on for 3 hours. It never should have taken more than minutes. Judge Karen Anderson presided. She was around my age, steel gray hair pulled back neatly, decades on the bench. The kind of judge who's seen every variation of human behavior and stopped being impressed by performances. I hoped that worked in my favor. The courtroom was formal and restrained, dark wood paneling, the flag behind the bench. Vanessa sat at the petitioner's table next to Richard Thornton. He looked exactly like I expected, tailored suit, confident posture, the easy smile of someone used to being believed. Carol and Robert Martinez sat in the gallery, watching with quiet satisfaction, as if the outcome were already decided. Elizabeth had told me Sophie was with a court-appointed advocate in another room. The judge had made it clear she would not be brought into this. Thornton opened first. He spoke smoothly about concern and responsibility. He described me as a 70-year-old man living alone, suffering from cognitive decline, prone to confusion and memory lapses. He said I was no longer capable of caring for my granddaughter who stayed with me often. He framed the petition as an act of love, protective guardianship, safety, appropriate placement. Vanessa took the stand next. She was composed, emotional in exactly the right places. She said I forgot to feed Sophie, claimed I'd left the stove on recently, said I missed appointments and grew disoriented. Carol followed her, talking about changes she'd noticed. She suggested my accusations were paranoia, delusions. Then came a few character witnesses I'd never met, friends of the Martinez family, all saying I seemed forgetful, diminished. Thornton rested his case by describing a memory care facility already selected, somewhere I could be supervised properly. Elizabeth stood. She objected and asked permission to present evidence before any ruling. Judge Anderson looked over her glasses and told her to proceed. Elizabeth walked to the evidence table and lifted the porcelain doll. She identified it as a gift given to my granddaughter on her 8th birthday. Even from where I sat, the glass eyes caught the light. A technical expert was called to testify. A young woman, precise and calm. She explained that a miniature camera had been concealed in the doll, active and transmitting wirelessly. She said she'd traced the signal to an IP address registered to the offices of Thornton and Associates. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Anderson stopped writing. Elizabeth followed immediately with the second item. A GPS tracking device recovered from inside the doll, transmitting to the same address. Elizabeth turned toward Thornton. She told the judge this had nothing to do with care or protection. It was surveillance. She said I'd been monitored inside my own home by the same attorney now arguing I should be locked away. Thornton was on his feet immediately, claiming the items were gifts and that neither he nor his office had any knowledge of what was inside them. Elizabeth didn't argue. She asked the court to hear what my granddaughter had endured. She signaled to the bailiff who cued the audio system. The courtroom went still. Sophie's voice came through the speakers, small and tired, saying she didn't want to practice anymore. Vanessa's voice followed, flat and unmistakable, instructing her on what to say when the social worker asked about me. She told her to be specific, to say I forgot to make meals. Sophie cried that it wasn't true, that I always made her breakfast. Carol's voice cut in, calm but firm, warning that if Sophie didn't say I needed care, something bad could happen. Sophie sobbed, saying she didn't want me to get sick. Vanessa told her to say the words anyway. Then Sophie repeated them, barely audible, her voice breaking as she said I couldn't take care of myself anymore. The recording lasted only a few minutes. It felt endless. There were audible reactions in the gallery. Someone whispered in disbelief. Judge Anderson's expression hardened completely. Vanessa clutched the arms of her chair, her hands pale. Thornton stared straight ahead, his composure slipping despite his effort to hold it together. Carol Martinez shrank back, suddenly small. When the audio stopped, the silence was total. Judge Anderson looked from Vanessa to Thornton, then to the Martinez parents. Her voice, when she spoke, was even and controlled. She told Elizabeth to call her next witness. Elizabeth stood and said my son's name. Marcus rose from his seat. Every eye followed him as he walked to the stand. He looked like someone stepping forward with no way back. He was sworn in and faced Elizabeth. She asked him to tell the court what he knew. Marcus spoke clearly. He said he'd known about his wife's relationship with Thornton for 6 months. He said he had messages discussing my estate, guardianship, and how profitable it would be once I was placed. He handed over phone records and hotel receipts. Elizabeth read portions aloud, messages about timing, about control, about liquidating everything within weeks, about finally being free. The courtroom erupted. Judge Anderson's gavel tapped once, crisp and final, but Marcus didn't pause. He continued, voice steady despite the tension. I was afraid of losing my daughter, he said, but after hearing what my wife did, coaching Sophie, threatening her, using a child as a weapon, I realized who I should have been protecting her from. I was a coward. I'm here to make it right. Thornton rose, trying to object. Your Honor, hearsay. Sit down, Mr. Thornton, the judge said firmly. David Sullivan was next. He testified about knowing me for 40 years, about our Tuesday chess games, about my mind being sharp, my memory intact. A financial expert confirmed I'd managed my $400,000 without issue. Elizabeth presented the Martinez family's history, showing the same pattern. Robert's mother institutionalized, her estate depleted. Vanessa was called forward. Elizabeth asked her directly if she had sent the doll knowing it contained surveillance equipment. Vanessa claimed her parents had sent it, insisting she hadn't. But the records told a different story. Her phone had accessed the doll's camera feed 47 times over 3 days. Vanessa faltered. The courtroom went silent. Concerned, yes. Concerned enough to threaten a child and coordinate with her lover to steal her father-in-law's savings. The judge removed her glasses, voice steady. I've heard enough, she said. The ruling followed. The petition for guardianship was denied. I was found fully competent. The matter was referred to the district attorney for elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, child manipulation, and illegal surveillance. The state bar would investigate Thornton for ethical violations and criminal conspiracy. Restraining orders were issued against Vanessa Crawford, Carol, and Robert Martinez. No contact with Sophie or me. Emergency custody of Sophie was granted to me. Marcus would work with family court. Vanessa's parental rights were suspended. The judge's words echoed, elder abuse is a crime. Using a child to commit it is unconscionable. This court will not tolerate it. 3 months later, Thornton faced criminal charges. Vanessa lost all custody. Supervised visitation was limited to 2 hours per month and only used once. Carol Martinez was under criminal investigation and the restraining order against her became permanent. Marcus was granted joint custody. Relationships began slowly rebuilding. I filed for divorce. I had full control of my estate. I remained Sophie's primary guardian. Sophie was in therapy, healing, and thriving. 3 months after the hearing, I stood with her in Dorothy's rose garden. "Grandpa," she said, tilting her head, "some kids said you went too far against Grandma Vanessa. Did you?" I knelt to her level, looking into her eyes. "No, sweetheart, I went exactly far enough. Sometimes people try to take what isn't theirs, your home, your freedom, your family. When that happens, you don't go quietly. You stand up. You don't look away, you fight. And if you're fortunate enough to have people who truly care about you, you come through it together, just like Sophie and me. They try to take my life apart piece by piece. My independence, my dignity, my granddaughter. They used a child who trusted them and built their plan on lies, assuming silence would protect them. But lies don't hold forever. The truth surfaces on its own schedule, and when it does, justice isn't excess. It's proportionate. It goes exactly as far as it needs to. When I look back over those months, I don't think about the house or the money. What nearly slipped through my hands was Sophie. I almost let the idea that family matters should stay private cost me her safety. The signs were there. The glint in the doll's eye, the rehearsed questions, Marcus's hesitation, his half-spoken warnings. I could have dismissed all of it, convinced myself I was imagining things. That's what they were counting on. In situations like mine, silence is the most effective tool predators have. I came close to giving it to them. I won't make that mistake again. If you see manipulation, you don't wait. You write it down. If you hear words being planted in a child's mind, you preserve them. If someone is exploiting vulnerability for money or control, you call it what it is. Protecting the innocent doesn't always feel gentle, and it doesn't always keep the peace. Sometimes it breaks families apart, but that doesn't make it wrong. I learned that loving your family can mean standing against them, even in a courtroom. Not every story about a grandfather is about warmth and quiet wisdom. Some are about endurance, about drawing a line when someone tries to cross it. Marcus found the courage he'd been missing. Elizabeth knew how to fight back. David stood beside me when it counted. Sophie is safe because I stopped treating this like a private disagreement and faced it for what it was. The road wasn't easy. I never expected it to be. But I would walk it again every time if it meant protecting her.